9 truths that become clear after 70, a Buddhist perspective you need to hear. Picture this: you're standing on the precipice of your life, looking back. The journey behind you, what does it reveal? A trail paved with true fulfillment, love, and purpose? Or do you find yourself facing a harsh reality, realizing that for much of your life you've been running after fleeting dreams, titles, status, and possessions that promised happiness but never truly delivered? What if I told you that the path you're on, the very journey you're taking right now, can be reshaped with just one simple shift in perspective? What if the wisdom of ages, passed down through generations, holds the secret to a life lived with more joy, peace, and meaning? Welcome to this video where we delve into the profound and often life-altering wisdom of Buddhist philosophy. It's a philosophy that speaks not just to the mind, but to the soul, guiding us to see beyond the illusions of modern life, beyond the endless chase for success and material wealth. Buddhism teaches us the profound truth of impermanence, that everything is fleeting, and yet in that very transience there lies the key to peace and understanding. In this world where we are often driven by external validation and the constant desire to accumulate more titles, more possessions, more achievements, it's easy to lose sight of what truly matters. But as the years pass, there comes a time when we must ask ourselves, is this all there is? This video is more than just a reflection on aging. It's a call to reconnect with the wisdom we often overlook. Through Buddhist teachings, we'll unlock 9 powerful truths, insights that can change how you approach not just the later years of your life, but every moment you have left. These aren't just abstract ideas. They are life lessons you can apply today to live more fully, more authentically, and with a deeper sense of peace. If you've ever wondered if there's a deeper meaning to life than the constant pursuit of success, if you've ever felt that gnawing emptiness that no promotion or material possession seems to fill, then this video is for you. By the end, you'll discover truths that will guide you toward a more meaningful, more connected life. You'll see that true wealth is not in what you own, but in how deeply you live. So before you move on to the next thing, I invite you to pause, take a deep breath, and watch until the very end. This could be the moment that shifts your perspective and transforms the way you live your life from here on out. If this resonates with you, if you find yourself wanting more of this wisdom, don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and share. Because what you're about to discover isn't just a video, it's a journey that will leave you changed. Let's walk this path together. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Status. In the quiet rhythm of daily life, we are often consumed by a relentless pursuit, the pursuit of status, titles, and external recognition. It begins early. From childhood, we're taught to seek validation. Good grades, athletic achievements, a respected career. It feels as if these markers of success will define our worth, that reaching these milestones will finally bring peace and fulfillment. But Buddhism teaches us a profound truth, one that may be uncomfortable to face. Attachment to these fleeting things is the root of our suffering. This pursuit of external validation is a form of grasping, a way of holding on to something impermanent. We accumulate status, titles, promotions, thinking they will bring us lasting happiness, but they don't. These accolades are like the shifting sands of a desert, momentary, easily blown away by the winds of time. What we once believed to be the pinnacle of success becomes nothing more than a shadow. The more we chase status, the more it slips through our fingers. The Buddha taught that everything in life is impermanent, anicca. Our careers, our relationships, and even our bodies are in a constant state of change. Yet, so many of us cling to the illusion of permanence, the belief that our identity is tied to what we do, the titles we hold, and the recognition we receive. We become so attached to these external markers of success that we forget the deeper truth. Our true value lies in our actions, our kindness, and our ability to love and connect with others. Take Robert's story, for instance. Robert spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, believing that each step upward brought him closer to the fulfillment he sought. By 58, he was the CEO of a major company, a respected, powerful figure. The world saw him as a success, yet when retirement came, everything changed. Suddenly, he wasn't the CEO anymore. His identity, which had been so deeply tied to his position, crumbled. The accolades he had worked so tirelessly for were now forgotten, gathering dust in a corner of his mind. He found himself in a quiet, empty space, no longer defined by his title. In the stillness of his new life, Robert began searching for meaning. It was then that he discovered a small Buddhist temple near his home. Drawn there by curiosity, perhaps even desperation, he began to listen. Day by day, he learned about the impermanence of all things, the very teachings that had once seemed foreign to him. One morning, as Robert swept the courtyard alongside an elderly monk, the truth began to dawn on him. True success had never been about titles or power. True success, he realized, was in the way he had treated others, the love and wisdom he had shared, the small acts of kindness that had once seemed insignificant in comparison to his career ambitions. He began to understand that his worth was not defined by his position in society, but by his ability to connect with others on a deeper level. There's a lesson here for all of us. We live in a world that often values people for what they do rather than who they are. But true peace, true fulfillment, comes not from external validation, but from within. It comes from understanding that our worth is not tied to the things we achieve or accumulate, but to the way we live our lives. It comes from the love we give, the wisdom we share, and the kindness we offer to others. A life well lived is not measured by how many titles we collect or how high we climb. It is measured by the connections we make, the lives we touch, and the love we give. In the end, the greatest treasure we leave behind is not in our bank accounts or professional accomplishments, but in the hearts of those who remember us for the kindness we showed, the wisdom we shared, and the love we gave. The Buddha's teachings remind us to let go of the illusion of status. When we stop chasing fleeting markers of success and begin to live with intention, love, and mindfulness, we open ourselves to a deeper, more meaningful way of being. True fulfillment doesn't come from what the world sees. It comes from the life we live, the impact we have on others, and the inner peace we cultivate along the way. As we age, the more we understand this truth, the more we can let go of the things that once seemed so important. In this letting go, we find freedom. We find freedom from the need for validation, and in its place, we discover the joy of simply being present, of being kind, and of truly living. Chapter 2: Freedom from Others' Opinions. From the moment we are born, we are exposed to a world of expectations. We are told what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and unacceptable, and how to behave in order to be loved and valued. As children, we crave the approval of our parents, teachers, and peers. Later, as adults, the need for validation grows more complex, extending to colleagues, social media followers, and society at large. We are conditioned to believe that our worth is determined by how others see us, by their judgments, their approval, and their expectations. This is a trap, and it is one that many of us find ourselves caught in, sometimes without realizing it. It is a cycle of constant seeking praise, approval, recognition, believing that only when we receive these things will we truly be worthy. And in this seeking, we often lose sight of who we really are. We forget that our true identity is not defined by the opinions of others, but by how we see ourselves and how we live in accordance with our values. Buddhism teaches us a profound truth about identity. There is no permanent, unchanging self that is defined by others. This concept, known as anatta, the doctrine of non-self, invites us to let go of the belief that we are fixed and defined by external judgments. Our true essence lies not in how others perceive us, but in how we align with our own inner truth. When we live with awareness, authenticity, and compassion, we are able to free ourselves from the endless cycle of seeking approval from others. Take Thomas, for example. For most of his life, Thomas was driven by the need to meet the expectations of his family and society. He pursued a prestigious career in law, not because he felt passion for it, but because it was what others expected of him. It was the path to success as defined by society, the path that promised respect, financial security, and social approval. But inside, Thomas never felt fulfilled. The career that looked perfect on the outside felt empty on the inside. One evening at a high school reunion, Thomas had a pivotal moment of awakening. He found himself speaking to old classmates, eager to impress them with his achievements. But as the conversation unfolded, he realized something startling. No one was truly paying attention to his career or his success. They were more absorbed in their own lives, their own concerns, and their own self-image. Thomas had spent decades shaping his identity based on others' expectations, only to realize that those judgments held far less weight than he had believed. It was then that he understood a powerful truth. He had been living for others, not for himself. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of liberation, as if the chains that had bound him for so long had suddenly been lifted. The pursuit of approval, the weight of societal judgment, these things no longer held any real value. The path that he had been walking was not his own, and he needed to break free. Thomas decided to leave the legal world behind. He moved to a small town far from the pressures of societal expectations and began doing something he had loved as a child, woodworking. This decision was a radical one, but it brought him a deep sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he was doing something that felt true to who he was, something that didn't require validation from anyone else. His work wasn't for accolades or praise. It was for the joy of creating, for the fulfillment of his own spirit. In Buddhism, there is a concept of Dhamma, the natural law or truth that governs the universe. To live in alignment with Dhamma is to live authentically, without being swayed by the opinions of others. True freedom is found when we stop living according to the expectations of others and start living according to our own inner truth. It is about understanding that the approval of others is fleeting, and it will never bring lasting happiness. Real happiness comes when we embrace who we truly are, when we let go of the need to conform and allow ourselves to follow the path that feels right to us. Thomas's story is a powerful reminder of the importance of living for ourselves. How often do we, like Thomas, chase after the validation of others, believing that it will bring us peace and fulfillment? How often do we make choices based on what others think we should do, rather than what our hearts tell us is right? The lesson here is clear. We must learn to free ourselves from the shackles of others' opinions. When we do, we discover a profound sense of liberation. In the end, Thomas didn't just leave behind a career, he left behind the need for external validation. He found the freedom to live authentically, in harmony with his own inner wisdom. The true gift of freedom lies not in what others think of us, but in what we think of ourselves. By letting go of the need for approval, we discover the joy of simply being without the weight of judgment. This lesson is not just for those in their later years, it is for all of us. As we grow older, we begin to realize that the opinions of others matter less and less. By the time we reach 70, most of the people we once tried so hard to impress are consumed with their own lives. Their judgments, once so important to us, are revealed to be insignificant in the grand scheme of things. So let us free ourselves from the need for validation. Let us honor the truth within us, live in alignment with our values, and cultivate a life that is true to our heart. When we do, we not only find true freedom, but we also find a deep, lasting sense of peace. Chapter 3: The Pointlessness of Holding Grudges. We all know the weight of resentment. It can consume us, cloud our hearts, and poison our minds. Resentment often feels justified, especially when we have been wronged or betrayed. It feels like a shield, something we can hold onto to protect ourselves from further hurt. But Buddhism teaches us that holding onto anger is not only counterproductive, it's ultimately a self-inflicted wound. Holding a grudge is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. Ultimately, we are the ones who suffer, not the person we are angry at. This is one of the most profound and liberating teachings in Buddhism. Letting go of anger, resentment, and grudges is not about excusing the actions of others, but about freeing ourselves from the chains that bind us to the past. When we hold on to anger, we are tethered to those painful moments, and we allow those moments to control our present and future. The act of forgiveness, on the other hand, is an act of release, a release that clears the path for peace, compassion, and joy to enter our hearts. Consider the story of George, a retired school principal who spent decades harboring resentment against a former friend. This friend, whom George had trusted deeply, had betrayed him in a way that cut to the core. The betrayal was personal and painful. For years, George carried the burden of this hurt, replaying the painful incident over and over in his mind. Every time he thought of his old friend, his heart tightened with anger, and the bitterness of that betrayal seeped into the fabric of his daily life. George's anger, though justified in his mind, was slowly eating away at him. He found it hard to move forward, unable to shake the weight of the past. Even in his retirement, when he should have been able to relax and enjoy his hard-earned peace, George remained trapped in the past. The grudge he held wasn't just a mental or emotional burden, it was a spiritual one. It kept him stuck, preventing him from fully experiencing the joy of the present moment. It was only after years of this struggle that George encountered a moment of realization. He understood that the anger he clung to was not hurting his friend, it was only hurting him. The friend had moved on, lived his life, and was likely unaware of the damage he had caused. But George's anger had bound him in chains, preventing him from experiencing the freedom that forgiveness could offer. One day, as he sat alone on his porch, George overheard his grandson in a heated argument with a friend. The words, "I'll never forgive you," echoed in the air, and for the first time, George saw his own reflection in the voice of his grandson. He recognized that same stubborn refusal to let go of the past, that same weight of anger that he had carried for so long. In that moment, something in George shifted. He realized that by holding on to this grudge, he was not punishing the other person, but only punishing himself. He made a decision: he would forgive. Forgiveness would not erase the betrayal or diminish its impact, but it would free him from the emotional prison he had built around himself. When George finally reached out to his former friend, it wasn't for reconciliation or to gain an apology, it was for his own peace. The moment he spoke those words, "I forgive you," a wave of relief washed over him. He had let go of a heavy burden that had defined so much of his life. Forgiveness, he realized, was not for the other person, it was for his own peace of mind. This act of letting go didn't just offer George emotional freedom, it allowed him to open up to the present. He was no longer held captive by a past he could not change. Instead, he was free to experience life with a heart unburdened by resentment, able to fully embrace the love and connection that surrounded him. The lesson here is profound. When we hold on to grudges, we are choosing to carry a weight that no longer serves us. Resentment, though it feels justified, ultimately harms no one but ourselves. It festers inside us, draining our energy, our peace, and our ability to experience joy. The act of forgiveness doesn't make what happened right, it simply makes us free. Forgiveness is an act of profound self-love and compassion. It allows us to step out of the shadow of the past and into the light of the present. When we forgive, we release the grip that past hurt has on our hearts, and in that release, we allow ourselves to live fully and authentically. Forgiveness is not about excusing the actions of others. It is about reclaiming our own power, reclaiming our peace, and embracing the beauty of the present moment. As we journey through life, we will inevitably encounter pain, betrayal, and disappointment. But we must remember this: the power to free ourselves from the chains of resentment lies within us. By letting go of the past and embracing forgiveness, we create space in our hearts for love, joy, and peace. In the end, the only person we truly free when we forgive is ourselves. Chapter 4: The Emptiness of Material Possessions. In a world driven by consumerism, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that material wealth can bring lasting happiness. From a young age, we are conditioned to associate success with accumulation, whether it's the car we drive, the house we live in, or the designer clothes we wear. More is better, the world tells us. The belief is simple: the more we acquire, the happier we will be. But as time passes and we reflect on our lives, many of us come to realize an undeniable truth. Possessions can never bring lasting fulfillment. The teachings of Buddhism offer a profound perspective on this. According to the Buddha, the attachment to material things is a root cause of suffering. The desire for more wealth, more possessions, more status keeps us in a constant state of longing, never allowing us to find true peace. Buddhism calls this state of endless striving tanha, or craving. No matter how much we accumulate, we are always left feeling like something is missing. The true richness of life is not measured by what we own, but by the experiences we cherish and the relationships we build. Henry, a man who spent the best years of his life climbing the ladder of financial success, is a perfect example of how the pursuit of wealth can blind us to what really matters. Henry had always dreamed of financial security. He worked tirelessly, sacrificing his time, his relationships, and even his health to accumulate wealth. By the time he was in his 50s, he had everything society deemed valuable: a grand mansion, expensive cars, an overflowing bank account, and a luxurious lifestyle. Yet, despite all his material possessions, something felt empty within him. One day, Henry decided to visit an old friend, Samuel, who had always taken a different path in life. Samuel had never been wealthy in the conventional sense. His house was modest, his belongings few, and his income modest at best. Yet Samuel was always smiling, always surrounded by a warmth and joy that Henry could never quite grasp. As Henry stepped into Samuel's simple home, he was struck by the stark contrast between their lives. While Henry's grand mansion stood empty and cold, Samuel's modest home was filled with laughter, stories, and the quiet hum of contentment. Samuel's life wasn't defined by the things he owned, but by the richness of his relationships, the depth of his connections with family and friends, and the love he freely gave and received. It was in that moment that Henry experienced a profound awakening. He realized that his mansion was an empty shell, a place that was full of things, but devoid of the warmth and connection that filled Samuel's small home. The material wealth he had so fervently pursued had not given him the happiness he had hoped for. Instead, it had created an emptiness, a void that could not be filled by possessions. This moment of clarity was a turning point for Henry. He understood that no matter how much wealth he accumulated, it could never replace the love, friendship, and shared experiences that Samuel had in abundance. The true richness of life, he realized, comes not from what we own, but from how we live, how we treat others, and how we spend our time. Buddhism teaches us the importance of non-attachment, not just to things, but also to our desires for them. The Buddha said, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." When we are attached to material possessions, we are trapped in a cycle of craving that clouds our ability to see the true beauty of life. We may gather wealth, but we lose sight of what truly brings joy. Connection, compassion, and presence in the moment. Henry's story serves as a reminder that no possession can fill the emptiness within us. The pursuit of material wealth can leave us feeling empty, disconnected, and unfulfilled. However, the pursuit of love, kindness, and meaningful relationships offers a richness that money cannot buy. When we shift our focus from acquiring things to fostering meaningful connections, we open ourselves to a life of true fulfillment. In the end, the lesson is clear. True wealth is not measured by the things we own, but by the love we share, the moments we treasure, and the connections we nurture. When we let go of our attachment to material possessions, we create space for the things that really matter: peace, joy, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically. True richness is found not in the acquisition of things, but in the cultivation of a life that is full of love, compassion, and connection with others. So, as we reflect on the course of our lives, let us remember: the greatest wealth we can possess is not found in things, but in the experiences we share and the relationships we build along the way. Let us move forward with open hearts, grateful for the beauty that surrounds us, and focused not on what we can acquire, but on how we can contribute to the happiness and well-being of those we love. In doing so, we will discover the true riches of life, those that no amount of money could ever provide. Chapter 5: The Trap of Perfectionism. In a world that constantly celebrates perfection, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that we must be flawless to be worthy. From the pictures we post on social media to the goals we set for ourselves, society often rewards perfection, pushing us to show only our best sides, to always strive for more, and to leave no room for failure. But Buddhism offers a radically different perspective on life. Life is inherently imperfect, and it is this very imperfection that makes it beautiful, meaningful, and real. The Buddha himself emphasized the concept of wabi-sabi, the Japanese term that celebrates the beauty of imperfection and transience. Everything in the universe is fleeting, ever-changing, and imperfect. To resist this fact, to continually chase after perfection, is to swim against the natural flow of life. It is like trying to hold on to water in your hands. No matter how tightly you grasp, it will slip away. Buddhism teaches us that striving for perfection often delays us from living fully. The constant pursuit of an unattainable ideal can lead to frustration, self-criticism, and a profound sense of dissatisfaction. We wait for the perfect time to start a project, to say what's in our hearts, or to take a risk. But by doing so, we deny ourselves the beauty of the present moment. The pursuit of perfection is a trap that keeps us locked in a cycle of waiting, never truly living. Consider the story of Alina, a woman who spent much of her life waiting for the perfect moment. From a young age, she was taught that life should be lived with care, that only the most well-planned, most polished efforts were worthy of attention. Alina wanted to write a novel, but she kept putting it off, convinced that she needed more time, more knowledge, more skill. Every time she sat down to write, she felt overwhelmed by the belief that her work would never measure up to her standards. She waited for the perfect moment to begin, only to find that the years passed her by. By the time Alina reached her 70s, she realized that all those perfect moments she had waited for had slipped away. She never took the leap because she was paralyzed by the fear of not getting it just right. The opportunities, the dreams, the projects, none of them had been realized because she had spent so much time waiting for conditions to be ideal. She had been so focused on creating something flawless that she missed out on the richness of simply doing. One afternoon, as she sat in her quiet home, Alina thought about all the things she had put off: trips she never took, stories she never wrote, feelings she never expressed. It was then that a deep realization washed over her. Life was never going to be perfect. The conditions would never align perfectly, and that was okay. What mattered was embracing the journey, imperfections, and all. So, Eleanor decided to begin writing. She stopped waiting for the perfect moment and started writing for the joy of it. She allowed herself to make mistakes, to write imperfectly, and to simply enjoy the process. The moment she let go of her need for perfection, she felt a sense of freedom. She wrote for herself, not for validation or praise. The words flowed freely, unburdened by the heavy weight of perfectionism. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder of the futility of chasing perfection. Perfection is an illusion, a mirage that keeps us stuck in a perpetual cycle of dissatisfaction and fear. We think that perfection will bring us peace, but it only leads to more striving, more waiting, and more regret. Buddhism teaches that imperfection is not something to fear, but something to embrace. In fact, it is in our imperfections that we often find our greatest lessons, our most authentic selves, and the true beauty of life. Perfectionism, by its very nature, delays our engagement with life. We are so concerned with making everything just right that we miss the richness of the moment. When we release the need for perfection, we free ourselves to live fully, to experience life as it is, with all of its flaws and unpredictability. It is in this acceptance of imperfection that we find true freedom. The lesson is clear. Life is not about waiting for conditions to be perfect. Life is about embracing the present moment exactly as it is, with all of its messiness, uncertainty, and beauty. As Eleanor discovered, the perfect time to act is not some distant moment in the future. It is right now, in this very imperfect moment. So, let go of the pressure to be perfect. Let go of the need to have everything figured out before you begin. Start now. Start with what you have, where you are, and with all the imperfections you bring to the table. In doing so, you will find that life unfolds in ways you never expected, and you will discover the joy that comes from embracing life, flaws and all. Chapter 6: The Fleeting Nature of Time. Time, an invisible yet profoundly powerful force, slips away from us moment by moment. It is something we all have in common, and yet we often take it for granted. We think we have time. We think there will always be tomorrow, next week, next year. We put off what matters, believing we have all the time in the world to pursue our dreams, to make amends, to say what we truly feel. But as we age, particularly as we reach our 70s, we begin to realize that time is not something that can be taken for granted. Buddhism teaches us that everything in life is impermanent, anicca, from the seasons that change to the very breath we take. Time itself is fleeting, and the present moment is all we truly have. Yet how often do we find ourselves caught in the trap of someday? We tell ourselves we will reach out to an old friend, travel the world, write the book, tell someone we love them tomorrow. But tomorrow is a concept, an illusion. The only moment that truly exists is now. Consider the life of Arthur, a man who had spent decades believing that he had plenty of time to fulfill his dreams. Arthur loved music. As a young man, he had dreamed of composing songs, of playing the piano with the kind of emotion that would resonate with others. But life, as it often does, got in the way. He got married, had children, worked tirelessly at his job, and each year the dream of music faded further into the background. Arthur promised himself that next year he would make time for his music, but next year always seemed to slip away. By the time Arthur reached his 70s, the dream of composing songs still remained, but his hands had grown slower and his energy had diminished. The piano, once a beloved companion, sat dusty and unused in the corner of his living room. Arthur thought, it's too late now. He had spent a lifetime postponing his dream, waiting for the perfect time, only to realize that the time had passed. Then one day, Arthur's granddaughter came to visit. She had just started learning the violin and was eager to share her progress with him. As she played, Arthur sat listening, struck by the raw beauty of the music she was creating. Afterward, she asked him, "Grandpa, did you ever play an instrument?" For the first time in years, Arthur felt the pull of his dream again. He thought of all the time he had wasted, all the moments when he could have started playing, but instead had let time slip by. But then his granddaughter, with the innocent wisdom only youth can offer, simply said, "Why don't you start now, Grandpa? You still have today." In that moment, something shifted in Arthur. He realized that despite his age, he still had today. The future wasn't guaranteed, but the present moment was all he had, and he could still choose to make it meaningful. He sat at the piano, his hands trembling slightly, but with a heart full of joy and urgency. The notes were clumsy at first, but they were his, and they came from a place of deep longing and authenticity. Arthur's story is a powerful reminder that time is not infinite, and that often we wait for conditions to align perfectly before we act. But by the time we reach a certain age, we realize that waiting for the right moment often means never acting at all. We miss the fleeting nature of time, and with it, the opportunities to create, to reconcile, and to express what's in our hearts. Buddhism teaches that impermanence is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Time passes, and so must we. The present is not just a bridge to the future, it is the only reality we can ever experience fully. The past is gone, and the future has not yet arrived. The present moment is all we have, and it is in that moment where life truly unfolds. Let's think for a moment, how often do we hold off on things we truly desire or feel we must do? How often do we say, "I'll do it tomorrow," or "I'll wait until things settle down," but tomorrow may never come and things may never settle. Life moves quickly. It's easy to think that we have time, but in the end, we are left with what we did or did not do in the present. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. Are there words you've left unsaid to loved ones, dreams that have been put off indefinitely, relationships that need mending? Now is the time. The Buddha's teachings urge us to live with mindfulness, to embrace the present as it is, and to act with the understanding that time is precious and fleeting. As we grow older, we come to see how much time we have wasted, but it is never too late to start living the life we want to live. The present moment is the doorway to all the possibilities we've been waiting for. Whether it's following a long-held dream, rekindling a lost relationship, or simply savoring the beauty of life around us, the time to act is now. When we embrace the fleeting nature of time, we stop waiting for the perfect moment and begin to live fully in each moment, understanding that time, once past, is gone forever. In that understanding, we find the power to make our lives rich, meaningful, and truly ours. Chapter 7: Health is the Real Wealth. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to get caught up in the constant chase for success, climbing the career ladder, accumulating wealth, and acquiring material possessions. We are told that happiness and fulfillment are tied to what we have, not who we are, but Buddhism teaches us something different. It teaches us that true wealth is not found in possessions, status, or even in financial gain. True wealth is found in the health of our bodies and minds. It is the foundation upon which all other pursuits rest. Without health, nothing else matters. The Buddha spoke of the importance of mindfulness and balance in life, emphasizing that without proper care of the body and mind, all the wealth in the world would be of little value. Our health, both physical and mental, is the true treasure we possess. Yet, how many of us neglect it in the pursuit of goals that may ultimately prove to be hollow? Take Richard, for example. Richard was a man driven by ambition. From an early age, he had a clear vision: build a successful business, secure financial stability, and create a life of comfort and luxury. His days were consumed with work. He woke up early, stayed late, and sacrificed sleep, exercise, and even his meals to chase the next deal, the next promotion, the next step towards success. His life was a constant balancing act between work, money, and fleeting moments of rest. He believed that once he had enough wealth, he could enjoy life to its fullest. By the time Richard was 72, he had achieved everything he had set out to do. He had built a multi-million-dollar business, had a sprawling home, and took luxurious vacations. Yet his health had deteriorated. Years of stress, poor eating habits, and lack of physical activity had caught up with him. He found himself in and out of the doctor's office, struggling with chronic health problems that he had once ignored in the name of success. One day, while sitting in his doctor's office, Richard received news that would forever change his perspective. His heart was weak, his blood pressure dangerously high, and his overall health was in sharp decline. In that moment, the reality of his situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He had spent decades accumulating wealth, but it had come at the cost of his health. No amount of money, no luxurious possessions could fix what had been broken. He realized that in his relentless pursuit of success, he had sacrificed the one thing that truly mattered, the health of his body and mind. Richard's story is a powerful reminder that we often take our health for granted while chasing external goals. We work long hours, eat poorly, neglect our physical well-being, and allow stress to rule our lives, all in the name of success. We tell ourselves that we will focus on our health later, after we achieve our goals. But as Richard learned, time waits for no one. When we sacrifice our health in pursuit of material wealth, we risk losing both. Buddhism teaches us to live mindfully, to care for our bodies and minds with compassion and awareness. The Buddha encouraged us to understand that our bodies are temporary, fragile, and subject to illness, aging, and death. This awareness should motivate us to take better care of ourselves, not in a selfish way, but as a way to honor the gift of life. Our health is not something to be taken for granted, and it is a responsibility we must cherish every day. Richard's realization didn't come too late. He made a conscious decision to change his life. He began by prioritizing his health. He started exercising, eating whole foods, meditating, and getting the rest he so desperately needed. He learned to find joy in the simple things, like walking in nature or sharing meals with his family. While he couldn't undo the damage caused by years of neglect, he embraced a new way of living, a way that respected his body, mind, and soul. The most valuable lesson Richard learned is this: health is the true wealth that supports everything else in life. Money, possessions, and career success may bring temporary satisfaction, but they cannot replace the vitality and joy that come from good health. Without health, everything else loses its meaning. It's only when we are well, physically, mentally, and emotionally, that we can truly enjoy life and contribute to the well-being of others. Buddhism teaches that our health is not just a physical asset, but a spiritual one. When we care for our bodies and minds, we cultivate a sense of balance and inner peace. We learn to appreciate life in all its forms and to live with gratitude for the present moment. In our pursuit of success, it is easy to forget that health is the foundation of all happiness. The Buddha's teachings invite us to remember this simple truth: take care of yourself. Prioritize your health, not just as an afterthought, but as a fundamental practice. By doing so, you will find that the true wealth you seek is already within you, ready to support every other aspect of your life. True wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in how you nurture the vessel that carries you through life. Your body and mind. Chapter 8: Relationships Matter More Than Achievements. In our society, success is often measured by the titles we hold, the accolades we receive, and the wealth we accumulate. From a young age, we are taught to work hard, strive for the top, and prove our worth through achievement. We are told that the more we accomplish, the more we will be valued. But Buddhism teaches us that true fulfillment is not found in what we achieve, but in the love and connection we share with others. The pursuit of success, while noble, often comes at a cost. In our quest to climb the ladder of achievement, we sometimes forget the people who truly matter, the ones who walk alongside us through life, the ones who love and care for us unconditionally. We neglect our relationships with family and friends, assuming there will always be time to connect later, after the next promotion, after the next project. Yet, as time passes, we often find that the relationships we've taken for granted have frayed, and the people we've neglected are no longer there or have grown distant. Consider the story of John, a man who spent his entire life chasing achievements. From the moment he entered the workforce, he was driven by ambition. He worked long hours, put in overtime, and sacrificed family dinners, vacations, and time with loved ones in the name of success. He believed that the more he accomplished, the more respect he would earn, and the more happiness he would find. He thought that by securing a top position in his career, he could create a better life for his family. But as John reached the peak of his career in his 50s, something began to shift. He realized that while his professional life was thriving, his personal life had suffered. His relationship with his wife had become strained. His children, who had once looked up to him, had grown distant. Friends he had once been close to were now acquaintances, and family gatherings had become rare. John had spent so much time focused on his career that he had neglected the people who truly mattered, the ones who had supported him, loved him, and helped him along the way. One evening, after receiving some disappointing news at work, John found himself sitting alone in his office, staring at a pile of accolades and trophies that had come with his success. But instead of feeling proud, he felt an overwhelming emptiness. All of his achievements seemed hollow in the absence of the people he had lost along the way. The trophies that once symbolized his hard work and determination now felt like mere decorations, and the awards, once sought after with relentless drive, felt meaningless without the love and connection of those who mattered most. John's story is a reflection of a truth many of us come to realize too late. The true measure of a life well lived is not in what we achieve, but in the relationships we nurture along the way. Success without connection leaves us empty. We can have all the wealth, power, and recognition in the world, but without love and meaningful relationships, we are left with a life devoid of joy. Buddhism teaches us that love and connection are the essence of life. The Buddha spoke often about the importance of relationships, how the cultivation of compassion, kindness, and understanding forms the foundation of a life well lived. True happiness does not arise from external achievements, but from the relationships we cultivate with others, from the love we give and receive. John's realization came too late to mend all of his broken relationships, but it wasn't too late to make a change. He began to shift his focus, making a conscious effort to reconnect with his family, to spend quality time with his loved ones, and to cherish the relationships he had neglected for so long. He started listening more, being present, and showing up for those who had always been there for him. It wasn't about grand gestures or achieving new milestones. It was about reconnecting on a human level, acknowledging his past mistakes and making amends where possible. The lesson we can take from John's story is simple but profound. Our relationships are the true treasures in life. The people who love us and who we love in return are the ones who bring meaning to our existence. Achievements, while important, are temporary. They can be lost, surpassed, or forgotten, but the bonds we share with others are enduring. Love, connection, and compassion are the true markers of a life well lived. Buddhism teaches that when we place our focus on the well-being of others, on showing kindness and compassion, we enrich our own lives. Relationships are not something we should take for granted. They are the heart of our human experience, and they require nurturing, attention, and care. By prioritizing the people in our lives, by showing up for them, and by investing in our connections, we create a life that is truly fulfilling. In the end, the wealth of our lives is not measured by what we achieve, but by how we love and how deeply we connect with those around us. True success is not about what we have. It is about the relationships we build, the love we give, and the bonds we form with others. And when we understand this, we discover that the most precious things in life can never be bought. They can only be nurtured through presence, compassion, and care. Chapter 9: True Happiness Comes from Within. For most of us, the search for happiness often takes us outward. We seek joy in achievements, recognition, relationships, possessions, and experiences. We are conditioned to believe that happiness exists somewhere beyond us, something to be attained or acquired. We think that if we just reach the next milestone, whether it's a promotion, a new car, a bigger house, or a dream vacation, then and only then will we be truly happy. But Buddhism teaches us a radical truth. Happiness is not something that can be found externally. It is something that arises from within. The Buddha spoke of the concept of dukkha, the inherent unsatisfactoriness of life when we depend on external things for happiness. When we tie our happiness to fleeting things, we set ourselves up for disappointment because everything external is impermanent. Relationships change, possessions wear out, and even our careers can shift unexpectedly. When we depend on these external conditions to fulfill us, we set ourselves on a path of never-ending pursuit, always chasing something just out of reach. True happiness, Buddhism teaches us, is not about what we acquire, but about how we experience the present moment and how we cultivate an inner state of peace and contentment. Margaret, a woman who had spent most of her life chasing external markers of success, is a perfect example of this lesson. From an early age, Margaret was driven by the need for recognition. She worked tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder, amassed material possessions, and sought validation through accolades and approval from others. She believed that happiness lay in achieving more success, more recognition, more things. But despite her success, she often found herself feeling empty, as if something was missing, like she had reached the top of the mountain, only to realize it wasn't as fulfilling as she had imagined. One year, while on a trip to Southeast Asia, Margaret visited a Buddhist monastery. She had read about Buddhism for years, but had never really understood its teachings. While at the monastery, she spent time in silence, meditating and listening to the monks speak of impermanence, mindfulness, and the nature of suffering. For the first time in her life, she began to understand that her quest for happiness through external achievements had been misguided. The monks taught her the concept of mindful living, being present in each moment without attachment to outcomes or desires. They spoke of cultivating an inner peace that is not dependent on success, recognition, or possessions. Margaret began to see that her pursuit of happiness had been based on an illusion, that the more she acquired, the more fulfilled she would be. True happiness, she realized, did not lie in what she had or what others thought of her, but in the way she experienced life, in the acceptance of the present moment, and in the peace she cultivated within herself. When Margaret returned home, she brought with her a new perspective. She didn't immediately discard the material achievements she had worked for, but she no longer saw them as the source of her happiness. She began to appreciate the simple joys of life, the sound of birds singing in the morning, the warmth of a cup of tea, the beauty of a sunset, the feeling of walking through the park with her dog. These small moments, which she had previously overlooked in her constant pursuit of success, now filled her with contentment. She realized that the emptiness she had once felt was not due to a lack of external achievements, but from a disconnect from the present moment, from not fully experiencing the life she had. Margaret's story is a profound reminder that true happiness is not something we can acquire, but something we must cultivate from within. Happiness is not about chasing external validation or accumulating material goods. It is about learning to live in alignment with our true nature, which is peaceful, content, and present. When we stop chasing and start embracing the present, we open ourselves to a deeper, more lasting happiness. Buddhism teaches that the mind is a powerful force. Our thoughts, our perceptions, and our desires shape our experience of the world. If we constantly search for happiness outside of ourselves, we are bound to feel unfulfilled. But when we learn to look inward to find peace within, we discover that happiness is already present, already waiting for us to notice it. The lesson here is clear. Happiness is not something to be pursued, but something to be realized. By letting go of the constant chase and learning to live mindfully in the present, we can find joy in the ordinary, in the simple, in the now. True contentment arises not from external circumstances, but from within. When we connect with this inner peace, we are no longer dependent on external validation or achievement for our happiness. Instead, we experience a deep, abiding sense of fulfillment that comes from being present with ourselves and the world around us. In the end, the greatest treasure we have is not in what we own or what we achieve, but in the peace and happiness we cultivate within ourselves. True happiness lies in the present moment, in the way we live each moment with awareness, gratitude, and compassion. When we learn to appreciate the simple joys of life, we realize that happiness was always there, waiting for us to see it. As we reach the later stages of life, one truth becomes crystal clear: time is finite. It cannot be paused. It will never grant us another chance to relive the moments we've missed, or to make up for the years spent chasing things that ultimately don't bring us true fulfillment. The most precious commodity we have is time, and once it's gone forever. But here's the great gift. Buddhist wisdom offers us a way to live fully in the present, right now, no matter how much time we have left. It teaches us that happiness isn't something to be sought externally, but something that arises from within. It shows us that the true treasures of life are not our achievements or possessions, but the relationships we nurture and the love we give and receive. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the time we spend with our loved ones in peaceful reflection and in compassionate action is the most valuable thing we can ever hold. But here's the catch. We can't afford to wait until old age to recognize these truths. We don't need to wait for the inevitability of time's passing to make these realizations. We have the power to embrace them now. Now is the moment to stop waiting for the perfect conditions, to stop chasing after the next big thing, and to start truly living. Let's not wait until it's too late. Let's make the most of the time we have today. As you reflect on these lessons, ask yourself, when you look back on your life, will you be able to say that you truly lived, that you embraced the joy, the love, and the peace that is available to you in every moment? That you didn't wait until tomorrow, but found happiness, connection, and purpose right here, right now. This video holds so much valuable insight, and it's not too late for you to make a change. If any part of this message resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with those who matter, and subscribe to this channel for more life-changing wisdom. Let's walk this path together, because the greatest tragedy is not aging, it's looking back and realizing we never really lived. Take action now, cherish your time, and live the life you deserve.